Today on Sex Positive Parenting, we're going to talk about not parenting per se, but the foundations of sex positivity. Because it's very difficult to say you're going to be a sex positive parent unless you've already decided you know what it means to be sex positive. So that's what we're going to talk about. And let me start with a short explanation from when we were going to have our first child, almost 30 years ago. We had many long talks prior to our first child coming and talking about all sorts of parenting issues. But one of the things we decided on was we were going to let our children see from the get-go that physical affection between mom and dad are normal, and that is a positive, healthy life that they don't need to be afraid of. And the way we decided is, first, simple things, is we decided, well, we're not going to be afraid to let them see us hugging and kissing. Whatever kids grow up with, as a parenting professional, I knew this, that whatever they grow up with becomes normal in their life. So we decided to make physical affection normal. But one of the parts of that to make human sexuality normal was we chose to go with an open door policy. And in our case, from the time before the children were born till into their teens, we never, ever shut our bedroom door. That means we were changing clothes, and it also means when we were making love. Did the kids see us? Absolutely. They would, if they came in while we were having sex, they came in. We would solve whatever problem they needed, and then we would send them on their way. Or if we had to get up, more than once, I had to get out, disconnect from their mother and walk to wherever they needed, and with my erection swinging up in the air, because we wanted them to see that as normal. And because that was normal from the time they were infants, there was never a point where it was abnormal. And so that was a way moving forward for us to make it normalized. So that when the day came, let's say my teenager daughter, one day she came, she knew I was shooting glamour news professionally, and she asked when she was about 14 to be my photo assistant. So she was helping me with nude photo shoots, even as a young teenager, because that didn't seem unusual to her. So I just wanted you to see that these are decisions you make way up front. You don't have to make decisions we made, but it is a decision that you have to consider. Now, we had never heard the concept of sex positive, but that's what we were doing at the time. The term did not popularize till much later. Now today, this is 30 years later, sexual politics are more toxic than ever. More than ever, we are having to watch our words and deeds, and people are watching from the right and the left, seeking to criticize. And so it's more important than it was then to know what you believe and why you believe it. First, one more thing before I start into any of these series is I want you to decide, or not to decide. You don't want to believe what I have to say because I say it. When I was teaching in graduate school, I used to tell my students, look, don't believe what I'm saying. I don't believe what I'm saying. Which was not really true. I was saying it tongue-in-cheek. But I did want them to weigh my words with their own knowledge, their own experience, and their own research. Because if I asked anybody to follow what I said because I said it, then I'm no better than the charlatans on talk radio. And finally, as a word of disclaimer, in this and all the rest of the series on sex positive, I speak from a distinct philosophical position. As an academic, I want to make this known up front. I am a openly liberal Christian, and I have a very clear and comprehensive value system based on my vision of what I should do and what right and wrong is. Right and wrong is not determined by empirical facts, it's determined by values. And I have a clear value set that I could explain in another session, but we don't have time for that. So just wanted to let you know that everything I say is impacted to that. So you have a different system of values, then you will need to keep that in mind. So let's talk about being sex positive. Sex positive is not just the opposite of being sex negative. Sex negative. Sex positive is not reactionary. Okay? Reactionary is when you see somebody do something, you're going to do the exact opposite. That is not sex positivity. That is being a reactionary. Because when you become a reactionary, you let your enemies define what you are. If you think you have to do the opposite because your Aunt Harriet, who is this radical conservative or a radical liberal, whatever they might be, if you didn't like them, so you're going to do the opposite with what they want you to do, that is putting them in charge. And as a parent, you cannot do that. As a parent, you always have to be clearly in charge of how you want your children to be raised, and their values will be set by you more than you can ever imagine. Now, before we go any further, I think we need to take a few minutes to look at why Western culture became sex negative. Now, this looks like a side trip, but before we can really grasp the sex positive lifestyle and belief system, we have to see where we became sex negative, because we as humans are not necessarily sex negative. My great ancestors, the Germanics and the Celts, they were not sex negative. They saw sex as a very positive force of nature. And there was no concept of a shame of their body or shame of sexuality. And so this was put on us. But why was it? Well, sex negativity worldwide is almost, not always, but almost exclusively tied to the monotheistic religions that came out of the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent. Why did these areas do that? Because in these early societies, they were very, very hierarchical. That there was a king who was a demigod, then there was steps down the ladder to a slave at the bottom. And of the population, the vast numbers are down somewhere in the bottom. And in that system, women were also property. They were way down, no matter what their status was. And that's important because those people at the bottom did not have agency over their own bodies. Okay? Sex was something they did to somebody, not with somebody. And that is one of the key sex positive concepts that you really want to grasp. I'll say it again. Sex is something you do with somebody, not to somebody. And if you have learned nothing else today, I hope you get that. Now, so the sex concept was now tied to ownership and control. So sex negativity can be seen as the desire to own and control the sexuality of somebody else. All right? So that could be your spouse. That could be somebody you don't know. It could be over the whole society. But sex negativity is always saying, I want to tell somebody else how to use or enjoy their sexuality. And only I have the right to decide that. And that is the root cause of the sex negativity that pervades Western civilization. The explicit sex negative beliefs, the nuts and bolts of them, almost all come back to a man named Augustine of Hippo, or St. Augustine. He was a writer and a philosopher and a bishop in the Church of Hippo in North Africa. And he lived his early part of life profligate. All right? He had sex with anything that would move, and he enjoyed himself. Then there was a day that this revelation came on him that all that sex he'd had was evil. So not only should he not have sex for fun, neither should anybody else. And for the rest of his life, he laid out what became the Western Christian Church's view of sexuality. And he made it very clear. Sex itself was an inherent sin. If you are enjoying sex, you are not enjoying God. So even if you have sex to have a child, which was the only acceptable way, you were supposed to try to divorce yourself from the good feelings because those are sinful. Sex was always bad. And therefore, everything to do with sexuality, the genitals themselves were a sign of evil. All right? So you have to understand this root that anything that is sexual is sinful. And that was drilled into the Catholic Church, or at that time, it was the church. And that is alive and well today. Not as much in Europe, but certainly in 21st century America, the religious right live and breathe and die by sex negativity. If you look at the beliefs that the religious right want to push on the rest of the country, they are virtually all tied to human sexuality. They don't like when two men have sex. They don't like two women to have sex. They don't want to have people have sex outside of marriage. They think masturbation is wrong. They think that teenage sex is wrong. They think abortion is wrong. Everything to do with sex goes back to Hippo. Because they're fundamentally, they see religion as all about attacking sex. You don't hear the religious right talk very much about the words of Jesus because, well, Jesus didn't talk about sex very much. He talked about selfishness and greed and things like that. Well, those aren't any fun. So that's why you only hear about sexual issues from them. They embrace a leader who epitomizes greed, but they don't care. It's all about sex. Now, the way we see this even in non-religious people, though, is in America, unlike in continental Europe, when you talk about teenagers, for instance, you always hear the term raging hormones, as if teenagers there's this roaring tiger inside the teenagers and they can't help but not control it. And if you give them an inch, if you don't tell them, no, sex is bad, no, I will beat you to death, I will throw you out of my house if you have sex, okay? Unless they do that, that tiger will take over. But that's the whole concept of sex negativity. As opposed to saying, teenagers, you're growing in certain ways and you have these new feelings and they are beautiful and they are glorious. And here's the way you can express them and explore and do so in a way that ensures the safety of you and everybody else. So you essentially take it as a positive instead of just say no. Sex ed in school, for instance, today. It is overwhelmingly sex negative. Now, when I had sex ed in school in the 1970s, it wasn't that way. My sex ed back in the 70s in Texas, as you think of the most conservative states, in Texas, was all very positive. They were presenting to us the options and the ways not to get pregnant and how the system works and how body responds and all these things. I never got the idea from my sex ed teacher that sex, even teenage sex, was bad. But of course, this was 1977 or so. It was certainly before the right-wing response in 1980 that started changing everything. But today, they're learning, beware of sex. Sex is dangerous. Beware of sex. That is the message, even in states that are not abstinence only. It is almost universally sex negative. And so our kids, if a teenager learns that when they are 18 or when they're 15 or 16 in school, when they become a parent, what do they see? They see their teenage kids as this is going to be evil and I've got to prevent it. So we've been indoctrinating systematically our kids with sex negative attitudes. It is also embedded with our laws that are grossly tilted to the idea that the government authorizes appropriate sex and does not authorize inappropriate sex. So that there are things that we aren't going to approve of or we're going to warn you of because it can hurt you. What do you think is the message to kids when they turn on virtually any show on cable now and at the beginning it says, warning, this has, brief nudity or sexual content or strong sexual content. Those warnings are telling them this is something that could hurt you. A view of a woman's nipple is inherently harmful. That makes no sense. But it is the way our young people are trained. And so the young people go through life saying, oh, this is an inherent negative. There's a reason why. Researchers told us that sex-positive parenting, they didn't use that word, but parents who see teenage sex as not necessarily evil and give that option to their children, those young people are actually less likely to be highly sexually active and even more less likely to do dangerous sexual activity than those parents who tell their children, no, sex is bad, you have to wait till marriage. That is the most dangerous approach according to actual empirical science. And so the kids grow up learning that their parents and the government are having to protect them from evil. And the evil is that evil thing called sex. It is even ingrained not just in the rightist, because it's easy to pick on the religious right, but on the left, we hear it, for instance, from the traditional nudist community. Over and over and over again, I see them drilling down the idea that nudism is not sexual. Nudism is not sexual. Nudism is not sexual. Why do they say that? If sex was a positive good, why would they feel obliged to say that nudism isn't sexual? Well, I know. There's legal issues why they're doing it. But I believe, and from what I've seen dealing with traditional nudists, is it has gone long. 50 years ago, it was all about law. No, 80 years ago, in the 1950s, it was all about law. Now it's part of their mantra. And that's why there are such draconian rules at quote, family nudist resorts for even the slightest physical contact. Paul and I went with some friends of ours to a family nudist resort. We normally go to adult-only nudist resorts. We think that's ridiculous that you can't show physical love. But so we were with some friends though at a family nudist resort, and I went to give her the wife a goodbye kiss, and she said, "Oh no, you can't do that," because that was absolutely taboo, and they could be thrown out as members. Okay, that's sex negative. And we also see it in, for instance, a segment of the feminist community who is vehemently anti-sexual, who are vehemently sex negative. These are the women like Andrea Dworkin, who got up and famously made the statement that sex in marriage is always rape. Okay? In her mind, sex is always an assault on women. Now, in her case, she was assaulted over and over again by people when she was a child. I get her position. But it's teaching an idea that sex is inherently a dangerous thing, and that unless it's kept under very strict guards, it will hurt you. That's a sex negative position. Now, so let's compare that to sex positivity. Sex positive is not a particular behavior. It's not I will do this, or I won't do this, or I will do this. It is a belief system. It is a fundamental core belief. And it has a single one mantra. Sex is good. Okay, let me say this again. Not just sex is good. It is glorious. It is beautiful. It is a way of affirming our humanity. It is a way of expanding the entire human species. It is a way to show love. It is a way to show friendship. It is a way that our bodies, when we are sexually aroused, are more in tune with the world than at any other time. Sex isn't just okay. Sex isn't just tolerable. It is an active positive. And that is something that most Americans have a very difficult time believing. They'll say it, but they have a hard time seeing. They don't see that human sexuality is the spring of goodness and life. Okay, I don't want to sound like a new ager, but that is simply the case. It is the spring of which we all come. Throughout history, there have always been people in cultures who have venerated sexuality as the giver of life, as something to be appreciated, and it's part of the celebration of joy. In many, many cultures, if not most ancient cultures, big annual celebrations had a sexual component. In many of them, there was the opportunity, maybe that one day of the year or a couple days of the year, for people to have sex with whomever they wanted. Wives were free to have sex with any man they wanted. Young people, it didn't matter, because this was when they are enjoying this bodily contact. Let's say during the spring solstice, this is the way they're celebrating the rebirth of the world, through the joy of sex. The joy of sexual arousal is, and mental, and orgasm particularly, is one of the best, if not the best, mental health exercises somebody can enjoy. It is a way to affirm, I'm okay. Now, if you've been drilled in the back of your head that sex is bad and the orgasm brings guilt, well, then we got a problem. Okay? Then the thing that should be bringing you mental health is causing you guilt, which is back to the why you want to raise your children with sex positivity. You don't want that guilt when they experience orgasm as whatever age they are, at 50. What you taught them when they were 6 is still going to impact their mind. All right? We want that orgasmic feeling to be a way to renew, which it is. And even Christianity, in the 1st and 2nd century, the early Christians fully understood when Christ and the apostles all talked about that Christ was the bridegroom and the church is the bride, and he comes into the bride and he enters into the bride, and then he fills her with the Holy Spirit. That's about sex. Christ is a groom. He puts his penis into the spiritual penis into the church and ejaculates the Holy Spirit. That's what they heard in the 1st century and the 2nd century. They knew what that meant. Today, if you say that, you're considered crazy. But those metaphors are very much drilled as part of the scripture if you see what you're looking for. But we've been saying sex negative so long, we don't even see it. So that all that to say is that sex positivity is a whole pantheon of things. And sexual symbols, they're all around us. They're all around you. They're all around your children. Sexual symbols start when they watch cartoons and they watch the way the males and females are drawn and portrayed. There's even sexual jokes, for instance. People make sexual jokes. What are they doing? They're laughing in most cases because the sex should be embarrassing, or they got caught doing something. Why do you think that guys call people jerk-offs, or across the bond they call them wankers? Why is it an insult to call somebody who masturbates? Well, everybody masturbates, but it's a negative. Now, when we say things like, for instance, sexism, when they talk about sexism on television, what we're really seeing, though, is that we're saying that the female sexuality is lesser. It's not that we want to ignore the fact that there are males and females. That's not good either, because we should revel in the fact that there are male and females. It is not wrong, for instance, and I disagree with some of my critic friends who, for instance, complain about the sexy costumes of female superheroes that accentuate their legs and their breasts and their buttocks, all right? Because they're accentuating they are women. They are sexual. There's nothing wrong with that. Sex is good. Sexuality is good. And presenting them as strong, as a hero, as thinking, as a well-rounded character who was also very sexual is not an attack on women. Okay, to say it is an attack on sexuality. Where the mistake is that the men aren't presented that way. Why doesn't Superman or Batman have a big codpiece the way that they did in the 16th and 17th century that shows a big erection there? Why doesn't there in the superheroes? Why don't they wear a sock that accentuates their sexual parts? Now that's the question. It's not that the female shouldn't be sexualized. Why aren't we saying that this man is manly and his sexuality and his penis and his scrotum and his behind are all part of that sexuality? Certainly his muscles are. Why we only show the muscles? Why not the rest? So we're hiding the sexuality of the men and showing it in the women. So the mistake is not showing it in the women. It's hiding in the men if we're sex positive. Oddly, those fighting for gender equality are often poisoned by the sex negativity that wants to make the genitals irrelevant. You know, they're trying, and I understand what they're trying to do. They're saying that people discriminate because someone has a vagina. All right, that's what sex discrimination is. We don't say it. We don't say it's vagina discrimination, okay? But that's what it is, breast discrimination. But they try to decouple that. They act like everybody is neuter. And that's nonsense. I think a better path forward for sexual equality is to see the gloriousness of both kinds of genitalia. No matter how you express it, okay? You might want to have a penis and wear a dress. That's great. But we are glorying in the fact that we are sexual beings, no matter how we express that. A sex-positive person celebrates the sexuality of those with both penises and vaginas. The gay pride community and the gay pride movement, this is Gay Pride Month right now, deserves credit because in their parades, what do they emphasize? They are all about sex. Some of the very first national parades in America that had nudity were gay pride parades. The gay men who they go and they show off. The lesbian women show their breasts. Why? Because they're not ashamed of their sexuality. So why don't we just embrace that and say, let's all embrace our sexuality in a positive way? So the first step in sex-positive parenting is going to be an examination of yourself. And this may not be easy. To see where those sex-negative impulses lie. When you're watching TV and you see a couple having sex, do you recoil? Now, if you're watching this video, you probably don't, but you know the kind of person that does. My wife, she worked at Victoria's Secret for 20 years, as those of you who follow my blog have know. And over again over the years, she would have people come in and complain about the pictures in the window because they were so offensive to a certain kind of person. Okay? How much of that is built into you? That's the question. Do you still have an innate recoiling to somebody who is celebrating their sexuality? And that's something you need to look at before you start considering how to be a sex-positive parent. Now let's talk about sex-positive people in general. Sex positivity, I'll give you a definition from Alan Gubish, who is a writer on sex positivity. Sex positivity is an attitude towards human sexuality that regards all consensual sexual activities as fundamentally healthy and pleasurable, and encourages sexual pleasure and experimentation. The sex-positive movement is a social and philosophical movement that advocates these attitudes. That's a pretty good academic definition. Now, the modern sex-positive movement came out of the counterculture. I'm just old enough to remember hippies. And my mother was very liberal, and so she saw hippieism as very positive. And she dressed in a sexy manner. Looking back, I didn't recognize it as sexy at the time. And it came from that. In many cultures, we already talked about that. For instance, the idea that sex positivity and the idea from, as I present in this blog or this website, that the idea of monogamy is sex negative. There have been many societies throughout even European history that have worked with collective sexuality, that any of the members are free to have sex with any of the other members. The most striking of these, and it was in the United States between 1848 and 1881, when the government shut down the Oneida community. And in their world, anybody any adult in that community, and adults were not defined the way we do. It was anybody who was sexually an adult, okay, 15, 16. They were free to have sex with anybody else within the community because they saw them as a Christian. They were married in Christ to everybody within the community. And what was interesting about the Oneida community, as the leader taught and the whole group taught, is that it was a sin for a man not to put the pleasure of the female first. He was way ahead of his time. He recognized the female orgasm well before medical science did. And they were taught that if a man ejaculates before the woman has climaxed, that was a sin. Hey, how you like that for sex positive? The other thing they did is the women were the one expected to initiate sex. Men did not initiate sex. It was always the women's choice. The women picked who they chose to be their lovers. And I thought that was an interesting way. And they were very successful. And the only reason they were shut down was the local authorities went to arrest everybody because, particularly the leader, because sex outside of marriage, legal marriage, was a crime in those days. And so he had to flee to Canada. Well, let's talk about the hallmarks of sex positivity to close down. The hallmarks of being sex positive is, one, the belief, like I said before, the core belief that sex is inherently very good. Second, a commitment to social justice. Okay, we haven't always called it social justice, but they started being called social justice about 1900, and actually it was the Christian community who coined that. You tell that to the Christian right now, they go crazy. But a commitment to social justice, because it is not possible to seek sexual justice if you do not put that in context of larger justice. Because if you don't, then sex becomes a weapon of oppression. In the end, we have to make sure we have a commitment to the immortal words that define actually political liberalism, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are inalienable rights. And unless we believe everybody has that right to pursue their happiness, then we cannot be sex positive. And if their happiness means that they are romantically attracted to people of the same gender or the same genitals, great. If they have a penis and they want to wear a dress, great, because they have a right to pursue their own happiness, and we do not have the right to tell them no. The only time we want to infringe is when they are harming harming somebody else, keeping them from happiness. So that is the core of what we have to believe first before we can truly make ourselves sex positive. A third basic concept that we want to believe in is a belief that pleasure, not just sexual pleasure, but pleasure is good and should be embraced. Okay, now let me say this again. Pleasure is good and to be embraced. There is a long-standing belief that asceticism, the idea of denial of pleasure makes you somehow better. Well, that's nonsense. Denying pleasure never made anybody better or happier. It might make them feel more powerful over themselves, but guess what? It doesn't bring happiness. Okay, pleasure is good. Pleasure is good. But now I've got to move the caveat. But we must have the commitment to seek the welfare of others as we seek the welfare of ourselves. So our pleasure cannot come at the expense of somebody else's. All right? So that basic concept, pleasure is good, but if that is encroaching on somebody else, I cannot do that. And finally, an understanding, and this may sound like a counter to everything else I've said. We have to have an understanding that sexuality can be perverted and is perverted into a weapon of and a tool of oppression and harm. Sex, there's no doubt, I spent a good part of my career working in the social work field. I unfortunately know all too much about sex being used as a weapon and harming people. So we have to recognize that while sex is good and glorious, it can be perverted to evil. All right, think of it in Lord of the Rings terms, that elves were inherently good and then orcs were the perversion of elves. All right, We have to know that those orcs still exist out there. And we cannot pretend. We can't go around with stars and eyes. We must be self-vigilant and not delude ourselves, because all too many people, and I've seen this with clients, they convince themselves, because of their sexual desires, that what they're doing is helping their victim. All right, even though an outsider can see, no, that's not what that person wanted you to do, but they convince themselves, at least at the moment, that that's exactly what they wanted. And we cannot afford that. We have to be vigilant that if I'm feeling strong sexual desires, that always has to be checked through. Is this something that person wants to? Remember, sex is something I do with somebody, not something I do to somebody. It is not sex positive, to dismiss, minimize, or ignore the widespread harm of sexual abuse and assault, or people's reports of it. It is so easy to say, oh, well, that really wasn't assault. But it was. If the person feels victimized, they were victimized. Right? That's important for us to understand. That we can't project just as much as when I was a social worker and I saw well-meaning counselors and social workers project onto somebody who had had sex that's unusual that they must be harmed and try to convince them that they were hurt by it. That was just as wrong as us saying, oh, you may feel that you're hurt, but you weren't. Okay? That's just as wrong. And so we have to see people as victims if they see themselves as victims. And if they see themselves as beneficiaries, we have to see them as beneficiaries, whether or not we think they should or could. So that's a short introduction to sex positivity. If you want comments or questions, my site and my blog are both open. Thank you. Today on Sex Positive Parenting, we're going to talk about not parenting per se, but the foundations of sex positivity. Because it's very difficult to say you're going to be a sex positive parent unless you've already decided you know what it means to be sex positive. So that's what we're going to talk about. And let me start with a short explanation from when we were going to have our first child, almost 30 years ago. We had many long talks prior to our first child coming and talking about all sorts of parenting issues. But one of the things we decided on was we were going to let our children see from the get-go that physical affection between mom and dad are normal, and that is a positive, healthy life that they don't need to be afraid of. And the way we decided is, first, simple things, is we decided, well, we're not going to be afraid to let them see us hugging and kissing. Whatever kids grow up with, as a parenting professional, I knew this, that whatever they grow up with becomes normal in their life. So we decided to make physical